Welcome to lesson 11 of our cultural diversity training. People, um, we're talking about people of and families of Asian descent. So we're going to explore the really incredible diversity and resilience and the complexities that characterize Asian and Asian American communities. So when we talk about Asian descent, we're referring to the vast geographic and cultural region that encompasses over half of the world's population. And this is going to be people from East Asia, Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, parts of Central Asia. And the experiences of an Indian immigration family, a third generation Japanese American, a first generation Vietnamese refugee. They're not interchangeable. So recognizing this heterogeneity is key here to providing culturally responsive care. So by the end of this lesson, you're going to be able to identify some major sociocultural themes and understand how the historical trauma and racism affect Asian American mental health and apply some culturally congruent counseling strategies that are grounded in respect and humility and social justice. So I want you to take just a moment and I want you to assume that you are Asian American. And think about these three lenses and write your thoughts about them. How do you perceive yourself as a member of this group? How might others perceive you? And how would you like to be perceived? So, to truly understand the lived experience of Asian Americans today, we have to trace the long arc of the United States history that really shaped how the Asian communities arrived, how they settled here, and how were they treated. And this historical context doesn't just belong in textbooks. It's alive in the collective memories, family stories, and just the body language of a lot of clients that we see in counseling. So let's start in the 1800s when the first significant wave of Asian immigrants, these were primarily Chinese laborers, when they were arriving to work in the gold mines and the railroads and agriculture and the different laundries that were out there. And they really helped build the backbone of American infrastructure. But as their numbers were growing, resentment from the white workers obviously followed. And so the economic and the racial tensions of that time led to one of the first major immigration restrictions in U.S. history, which was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And this law explicitly banned Chinese laborers from entering the country, and it barred the existing Chinese residents from becoming citizens. And it institutionalized xenophobia and it set the stage for like decades of exclusionary immigration policies. And then a few decades later, we had the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907, and that really targeted Japanese immigrants. It wasn't just a formal law, but rather a diplomatic understanding between the US and Japan. Japan would stop issuing passports for laborers headed to the US, and in return, the US would allow the families of Japanese residents that were already here to join them. And then on the surface, that sounded fair, but in practice, it was just another method of restricting Asian immigration while maintaining that political decorum. And then came one of the darkest chapters in American history. We have the World War II, the internment camps. And so this followed the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941. There were over 120,000 Japanese Americans, and 2/3 of them were U.S. citizens that were forcibly removed from their homes and then sent to these incarceration camps across the countries. So families lost their properties, their businesses, their trust in the government, and the trauma of internment is definitely intergenerational. Many descendants of these internees still carry that inherited fear and shame or silence around authority. Another lesser known policy is the Tydings-McDuffie Act of 1934, and this reclassified Filipinos from U.S. nationals to aliens. And so it effectively cut off the Filipino immigration to the mainland. And this act was deeply ironic. The Filipinos had been recruited in large numbers to work on Hawaiian plantations and the California farms because of the U.S. colony ties with the Philippines, but now they're excluded from the very country that governed them. And so then we have everything changing when the Immigration and Nationality Act happened in 1965. And so this landmark legislation really abolished the race-based quotas, and it opened the door for the immigrants from Asia. It also opened the door for immigrants from Africa and Latin America. And after nearly a century of exclusion, the Asian immigration surged. So we have highly educated professionals like physicians, engineers, scientists, and they start arriving in large numbers. And that's going to make a shift in the demographic makeup of the Asian community in America. And then comes the post-Vietnam War refugee era in the 1970s. So we have waves of Southeast Asian refugees that are fleeing conflict in Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos, and so a lot of these people are arriving with some really deep trauma and very minimal resources and limited English proficiency. And so they're resettling in these low income neighborhoods or rural areas where the access to those culturally sensitive mental health care was almost non-existent. And then, now we have like modern globalization that's continuing to transform the Asian American demographics. And today's migration is going to include international students and tech professionals and entrepreneurs from across the continent. And the children of these new immigrants are navigating this complex identity because they're kind of caught between like the heritage expectations and the fast-paced, often individualistic culture of the United States. So from exclusion to inclusion, from laborers to professionals, from refugees to innovators, each chapter in this timeline is carrying emotional and psychological weight. So as counselors, it's our job to recognize these historical layers. Like a Filipino elder may carry memories of colonial hierarchies, and a Cambodian refugee might still live with those echoes of war. And a Korean American engineer might struggle with unspoken generational expectations that are rooted in their family's migration journeys. So history isn't abstract. It sits in the counseling room with every client. And when we listen with a historical awareness, we don't just treat symptoms. We honor the resilience and the resistance that have always define those Asian American communities. So, to better understand the socio-political context in which the Asian Americans are living, it might be helpful for us to examine how Asian Americans have been perceived and treated within the United States. And institutional racism is really reflected in the regulations, the laws, the policies, and the procedures that are restricting the lives of people on the basis of race. And that's consistent with the historical examples of institutional racism that I previously discussed. So Asian Americans are just continuing to encounter those contemporary forms of institutional racism. According to the United States Commission on Civil Rights, more current examples of institutional racism against Asian Americans would be like English-only language incentives or initiatives, income to education disparities, and that's kind of like where Asian American people, they're earning incomes that are disproportionately lower than white people with that same level of education. And then we have like the glass ceiling effects in career advancement, where Asian Americans, despite their experience and their training, they're underrepresented in administrative and managerial positions. And Asian Americans also continue to experience individual racism, from people who endorse or act upon those beliefs of their social group's superiority over another group. So some examples of that might be like differential treatment, verbal insults, racial slurs to, anywhere to physical harassment, vandalism, and even in some cases homicide. So the murder of Vincent Chin in 1982 by the ex-auto workers who regarded him as the reason for losing their jobs. And then we had like the 1987 murder of Navroz Modi by a Jersey City gang called the Dot Busters, which that kind of referred to the South Asian women's bindis, the dots on their foreheads. And then these have been really galvanizing rally points for the Asian American community. And so the discrimination that Asian Americans face is directly related to stereotypical perceptions and certain attitudes that people have about them. And so we have this large scale arrival of Chinese immigrants in the 19th century, and the xenophobic portrayal of this immigration wave, we called it the yellow peril. And these Asian American stereotypes have really cast this community as like, quote unquote, the others. And so we have images of like Asian Americans as like heathens or dog eaters or martial artists or exotic or dragon ladies. And these have really objectified the community by reducing them to one-dimensional characters that are kind of set apart from the dominant white society. So these stereotypes are adding fuel to the treatment of this community as like economic labor, cultural, and more recently like national security threats to what's deemed like mainstream America. So, what's particularly relevant here to the contemporary Asian Americans are the stereotypes of like the perpetual foreigner or the model minority. And so the seemingly innocuous question of like, where are you from? And that might be, that part of that stereotypical perpetual foreigner idea. And then we have like the national headlines that say, America beats Kwan, in reference to like the native California figure skater Michelle Kwan. And it's like the perception of Asian Americans as being perpetual foreigners has been this persistent theme in the daily experiences of Asian Americans. Despite the repeal of the anti-naturalization laws that explicitly prohibited them from being citizens, Asian Americans continue to be implicitly regarded as prohibited from being the citizens. They can't be, they're classified as like illegitimate Americans, regardless of their nativity or their citizenship. So, there was like campaign finance scandals and racial profiling. I think back to Winho Lee at Los Alamos National Laboratory, and the presumptive treatment of South Asians as, the terrorists since, September 11th have really further perpetuated that perception that Asian Americans are not only foreigners, but they're foreigners who can't be trusted, and they're potential threats to national security. So ultimately, being an American is equated with, almost being white. And without the option to cast aside their visible racial differences, Asian Americans at best can claim like a hyphenated status. So that there's the implicit second-class status of that perpetual foreigner stereotype, and that stands in distinct contrast to the model minority myth. So in 1966 in the New York Times Magazine, there was an article titled "Success Story, Japanese American Style." And so this model minority stereotype has really been used to describe and elevate the status of Asian Americans. But according to this stereotype, Asian Americans as a group have really become a model community that's kind of overcome its minority status, despite those barriers that, are presented by racism. And presumably, the high academic achievement, the high family incomes, the low mental health utilization rates, and then we have like low delinquency rates of Asian Americans. All of these are indicators of this community's success. But numerous scholars have really noted that the emergence of this stereotype kind of coincided with the racial unrest of the civil rights movement. And so you have this presumed success of Asian Americans, and it's used to pit the racial groups against one another. And at the same time, it minimizes the racial and socioeconomic inequities that are raised by communities of color. So, to counter these idyllic portrayals of Asian Americans, some of those scholars further argued that, the aggregation of Asian Americans into a seemingly homogenous and monolithic racial group really fails to account for the how diverse this community is. And so it's overemphasizing Asian American success while it's obscuring legitimate racial disparities. So let's take a moment to just reflect. I want you to explore some various Asian American communities through the web. Start with reading discussion forums like on the angryasianman.com, or it's angryasianman.com. Then there's some on mixedasians.com and then apiablogs.net. And I want you to write down what your reactions are to those postings. What really resonated with you? And is there anything that's unfamiliar to you? And how are these views similar to or different than the perspectives that you have already been exposed to? So when we use the term Asian American, we're actually referring to one of the most diverse populations on Earth. And this spans more than like half the global population. It's really tempting to kind of think of Asian as just one single identity, but in truth, it's representing the extraordinary range of ethnicities and languages and histories and faith traditions, because there are over 20 distinct ethnic groups that are commonly recognized within Asian America. So we have like everywhere from East Asia, like Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and then we have like Southeast Asia, which is Filipino, Vietnamese, Cambodian, people from Laos, Burmese, Thai communities, I'm sorry. And then we have the South Asians, which came from India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and Nepal. And then we have the Pacific Islanders and people from Central Asia. And each of these communities is carrying unique cultural norms and foods and dialects and social structures. And there's more than 100 different languages and dialects that are spoken across these groups. That's a lot of languages, which means communication preferences are going to vary widely. A client who maybe speaks Tagalog at home may think and dream and emote differently than a Mandarin speaking client. And even among speakers of the same language, there's idioms of distress that are going to be different. So what sounds like anxiety in one linguistic context might be described as like wind sickness or loss of balance or spirit heaviness in another one. So we have to take that into consideration. We also know that religious diversity is equally profound. So we might encounter Buddhist clients who emphasize detachment and mindfulness. Maybe Hindu clients whose worldview is going to center on karma and dharma. Muslim clients who integrate prayer and fasting into their daily life. Maybe some Christians who frame suffering through faith. Sikh clients from whose, service and equality, those are sacred to them. And then maybe even clients whose beliefs blend the ancestral traditions with like the modern spirituality. So recognizing these varied belief systems is going to prevent us from collapsing everybody into one single cultural narrative, so to speak. And then we have like the immigration stories that are going to add just another layer. Some people, their families arrived generations ago, and they're deeply rooted in American society. And others came as refugees that were escaping war, or highly educated professionals in technology or medicine or academia. And these reasons, they're the reasons why people immigrate, whether for opportunity or safety or education. And it's going to shape their expectations of counseling and the relationship to the authority figure. And because of this diversity, the counselors have to resist the urge to generalize. Instead of asking, what do Asian clients need? We need to ask, who is this individual in front of me? What is their heritage story, their language, their migration path? What's their faith and family structure? How does all of that shape this person's worldview? So, to provide culturally competent care, we have to start with humility. We have to assume that there is more to learn than we already know. So, we want to invite our clients to teach us about what home means to them, their festivals, their family hierarchy. What are some of the moments of pride or pain that are tied to their identity? And this curiosity is going to communicate respect, and it's going to lay a groundwork for trust, which is really the true foundation of effective multicultural counseling. And while Asian cultures are going to vary widely, several shared values are going to influence the worldview and behavior. So we have collectivism, which emphasizes the welfare of the group, particularly the family, over just the individual goals. So maintaining the family honor, which is like saving face, that's going to be essential for this population. And personal failure might bring shame to one's entire kin network. And then, so we have filial piety, which is a deep respect for parents and elders. It's a cornerstone in many Asian families, and this is going to lead a lot of clients to prioritize the parental expectations over their personal aspirations. It's a common source of intergenerational conflict. And then we have education and perseverance, and these are seen as moral duties often. And success is not only a personal achievement, but it's a way to lift up one's family. And then we have emotional restraint and harmony. These are kind of prized in this community. So expressing distress openly might be seen as like a weakness or even as disrespect. And counselors might misinterpret quietness or avoidance or minimal emotion expression as resistance when in fact it's just reflecting the cultural norms around modesty and self-control. So within the Asian community, family or kinship is going to refer to that extended network of relationships that encompasses several households. And in a lot of these instances, multiple generations and caretakers might reside in that family. And they're going to influence the decisions as well. So, like, for instance, it's been noted that like older siblings are going to play a really important caretaking role in South Asian communities. And significant family members who might reside in the country of origin may also exert psychological pressures, and they're going to influence the decision making in the families in the United States. So the family is considered to be of primary importance, and so the family needs are often going to override the individual needs. And then, the notions of like private space or individualistic identity go against that Asian collectivistic value orientation because one's actions are going to be considered to influence the welfare and the integrity of the family. And so this emphasis on a family identity and interdependence is going to make the filial piety a strongly espoused value in the Asian American family. And within this context, obligation and respect and a strong sense of duty to the parents and elders is pretty common. In fact, a strong allegiance to the parents can continue after the adult offsprings, especially the male child, are married. So it's common for the adult children to reside with their parents until and then even after the marriage, and for married sons to take care of the parents in their old age. So this emphasis on family is going to play an important role in kind of like saving face and protecting the honor of the family. And it's, this is really influenced by like parenting that tends to be authoritative and directive. So the actions are going to benefit the family. And when those actions do benefit the family, they're praised. But then we have like the guilt-inducing techniques, like withdrawing the family support, that are used as a mean to enforce discipline and maintain that family cohesion. So, socialized primarily within this patriarchal society, a well-functioning family is one that kind of prescribes to the specific gender roles and the communication rules that are set by the family. And the gender roles and the responsibilities are clearly prescribed, and it's based in one's authority and status in the family and the social hierarchy. So, for instance, here, like, age is valued, and elders are kind of given great respect and importance. Respect is implied in the obedience, in them being formal, and like social restraint in the relationships with the elders. And men are the primary decision makers in the family, whereas the women's roles are, you know, their status is like primarily evolving from being married and having children. So education's kind of seen as like a marketable tool in marriage for women, but it's important to note here that, there are within group differences. So, for example, like Japanese Americans tend to be more acculturated, and so they're going to be more egalitarian in their roles because there's been several generations that have kind of lived in this country. Filipino Americans tend to be more egalitarian, whereas like Chinese Americans and Koreans and Southeast Asians, they tend to be a little bit more patriarchal and traditional in their orientation. But then on the flip side of that, like the South Asians have been noted to be traditional in their homes, but contemporary in relation to education and achievement related issues. So, um, an important aspect of interpersonal relationships is issues related to intimacy and marriage. Asian American youth are traditionally not encouraged to date. Um, Dating and sexuality are, intimately linked, and parents often fear the negative repercussions related to the dating. And a lot of times, the parents and the extended family are going to play a really important role in choosing a mate for their children through like different social networks. So, for example, like arranged or semi-arranged marriages are common practice among the South Asian communities, and the children are typically encouraged to marry within their ethnic community. And because marriage is considered a union of two families, the choice of mate involves introducing those potential candidates from families that have good educational and financial backgrounds. But marriage based on love and mutual compatibility has increasingly become a norm for Asian American youth. Although Asian Americans traditionally tend to be a little bit more modest regarding their sexuality, and they're really non-demonstrative in their sexual and physical affection, there are generational variations based on like how acculturated they are. So, like, for instance, the more acculturated the individual, the greater likelihood of being demonstrative and having open discussions regarding sexuality and dating. Um, Divorce and interracial marriages have traditionally not been common practice among Asian Americans. Um, According to the U.S. Census, it indicates that less than 10% of Asians are likely to be separated or widowed or divorced. So, Japanese Americans actually have the highest rates of divorce there. And, those trends suggest that, there are specific genders and ethnic differences among Asians who marry interracially. Um, so, for instance, here, compared to like 23% of Asian women, only 12% of Asian men marry interracially. And in terms of ethnic and gender differences, Japanese Americans, it's going to be 20% of the men and 41% of the women, have been known to have a higher percentage of interracial marriages as compared with like the Filipinos, which are only 13% of the men and 33% of the women. And then with Koreans, it's only 4% of the men and 27% of the women. And these trends are suggesting greater intermarriage among a lot of the U.S. born Asians as compared to the immigrant Asian Americans. But it is interesting to note that, among those Asian Americans, the foreign-born Asian Americans or the Asian Indians actually seem to engage in higher interracial marriages than the US-born Asians. And when we're talking about education, Asian Americans have a high regard for learning. In most Asian American families, academic achievement and a successful career are highly valued, and it indicates a good family upbringing. So the educational emphasis is seen as kind of going beyond the individual to enhance the whole family. So there's this pressure to spend time studying at the expense of like the other extracurricular activities. And while the pressure to obtain certain jobs like science related or technical jobs over other jobs like psychologists and whatever, that's kind of been noted as like this cultural expectation more recently. Asian Indian parents kind of believe that these choices went beyond culture to ensure that their children gained occupational and financial security because they're minority members in the U.S. Um, and others have kind of argued that you know in response to those perceived restrictions and limitations due to discrimination, Asian Americans are going to place a higher value on education as one of the most reliable means of like that upward mobility. And this is a concept they refer to as relative functionalism. And depending on the geographic region, different religious teachings are going to serve an important spiritual philosophy that's going to guide American lives or Asian American lives. So, like for instance, here, East Asian Americans, like the Chinese Americans, they tend to follow Confucianism and Buddhism and Christianity. And then there was like a Spanish influence on the Filipinos, and so oftentimes Filipinos tend to be Catholic, whereas like Buddhism and Christianity and Shintoism, they're the primary religions among the Japanese Americans. And although Hinduism is the major religion in South Asia, Islam, Sikhism, Jainism, Zoroastrianism, there's other faiths, Judaism, they're all practiced in India and other religions of like South Asia. And then we have Southeast Asians, like the Cambodians and people from Laos, and they were strongly influenced by Hinduism and Buddhism. But the Vietnamese practiced Buddhism and Catholicism. And then, the Minh and the Hmong tend to believe in the supernatural powers, and they're animistic. And either based in a polytheistic or a monotheistic notion of God, a majority of these Asian communities believe in fate and rebirth and an afterlife. And commiserate with this belief is, that pain or stress and pleasure are essential to our existence and a natural part of this lifelong process. And so these religious philosophies are going to influence the person's perspectives on life and health and illness and all types of things. And so in these communities and the places of worship and the religious figures, whether it's the priest, the minister, the mullah, the imam, the pundit, the monk, whatever, they may be key sources of support during the times of difficulty. And then alternatively here, there might be several Asian Americans who are atheists or agnostic. And while death is a universal phenomenon, expressions of grief and these death rituals are going to vary by ethnicity and also by religion. But the basic premise underlying these death rituals seems to have a common thread among the different Asian communities. So death is like this communal affair among several Asian type groups. So burials and cremation ceremonies, they're traditionally performed by males in the family, and elders are often consulted in performing the rites. Another common theme here is the impact of the rituals on the family and on the deceased. The Hmong people believe that proper burial and ancestral worship are going to influence the health and the safety and the prosperity of the family. But Buddhists are going to believe that proper burial rituals and like the state of mind of the dying person are going to influence the rebirth process. And for Hindus, cremations and other death rituals are going to be designed to assist with the rebirth and release the soul from its earthly existence. And for Muslims, the burials are crucial to the Islamic belief in the physical resurrection of the dead. So let's look a little closer at ethnicity and race here. Ethnicity refers to shared but unique cultural values and traditions and norms and customs within an ethnic community. But race refers to like this arbitrary classification system that is based in positions of power and privilege. So in the United States, ethnicity and race are going to operate as essential frames of reference through which, social interactions are going to be interpreted. And against this backdrop, acquiring an ethnic and racial identity becomes really important as people are navigating their relationships and they're maintaining visibility within the context of both the culture of origin and the dominant culture. And although the process of ethnic identification it starts really at a young age, with the family playing a significant role in this socialization process, the social construction of ethnic identity within the context of a U.S. society is going to take on like this unique and different meaning for those Asian Americans. Growing up in a bicultural setting, there's a fundamental dilemma that's evolving for Asian Americans, and it's to the degree that which one's ethnic identity is going to be valued, and that has to be retained. So while the ethnic identity research has revealed that a strong attachment and sense of belonging to a person's cultural roots and traditions has a positive psychological outcome for Asian Americans, some believe that the tendency to focus on attachment to that Asian ancestral country of origin alone tends to kind of obfuscate the other identifications that Asian Americans have, because ethnic identity might function differently for foreign-born Asians versus the U.S.-born Asians. And there's a need to understand ethnic identification more broadly, so we can include the attachment that a person feels to their cultural heritage, including those that are not based specifically on their country of origin. So for instance, ethnic identification, it was a greater buffer against stress for foreign-born first-generation South Asians than the U.S.-born second-generation South Asians. And there was some other results that were found in the 2000 study by Ying, Li, and Tsai, and they did a study on foreign versus U.S.-born Chinese Americans, and they had similar results there. But in essence, because of this bicultural influence, Asian Americans internalize two cultures that inform and influence their lives. They have the Asian identity and the American identity. And although being, American is not consistent with an ethnic identity, identifying with an American identity and being seen as American provides Asian Americans with this sense of belonging and a sense of legitimacy and cultural competence that's really just increasing their ability to navigate interactions effectively and to access resources. Interestingly here, how the particular aspects of identity may operate in particular situations is really influenced by the social cues that the Asian Americans experience. Also, the exposure and connection to the cultural context, like if they go visit Asia or they have a lack of contact with Asia. And there's some aspects that are seen as a little bit more salient than others, but the different aspects of identity may be activated based on the different contexts. And we call this cultural frame switching. And that's kind of related to the varying aspects of identity is the role of racial identity in American or Asian American lives. So the concept of race and racism has really been elusive for Asian Americans, despite this like long history of racism and discrimination, because they've been denied land ownership and citizenship, and there's anti immigration laws and racial profiling, and they've been the target of racial slurs and violence and internment camps and all of this other stuff. And there are varying views of acceptance from within and outside the community. So the difficulty in recognizing that Asian Americans experience discrimination is kind of a function of several factors. The model minority myth, the tendency to dichotomize racism as a black-white issue, and a lack of racial socialization, and really just a language to speak to these new issues among the new immigrants. We also have like related racial politics of like success and economics, and those factors are masking the negative effects of the discrimination on the well-being of these Asian Americans. So to counter this, back in 2006, Alvarez, Wang, and Lang, they found that the discussions around race and racisms with significant people in a person's life are critical to enhancing the Asian Americans' awareness of racism. But there has been a greater attention to and awareness of racism within this community due to the discrimination. So there's been some reports of like an increased anti-Asian sentiment since the terrorist attacks on 9/11. So there have been like racial microaggressions that have really come in the form of like micro assaults, like racial slurs, calling people chinks or saying they're fresh off the boat. The ABCDs, American born confused, decis, micro insults, like the assumption that Asian Americans might not be good managers. And then there's like micro invalidations, like Asian Americans complimented for speaking good English or speaking without an accent. And these forms of discriminatory acts really relegate Asian Americans to like this perpetual foreigner status, despite several generations of having grown up in this country. And, the intersections of the ethnic and the racial identities must be considered when working with Asian Americans. And the traditional Asian culture suggests really clear and stringent gender roles for Asian men and women, with several religious teachings like Confucianism and Hinduism. And so seeing masculine and feminine characteristics intrinsic and complementary to each other. So in keeping with that, there's this like greater variability in notions of masculinity among Asian men when compared to white men. And that's based in like the Asian cultural views. The men are brought up to be group and family focused. And so they need to fulfill that parental and familial expectation, and they're expected to be the main breadwinner in the family. But due to like this patriarchal emphasis, men seem to kind of experience less stringent rules and expectations in relation to like sexual barriers and intimacy. And Asian women, on the flip side of this, are going to experience greater community censures related to like the gender roles and the intimacy issues. And they're going to bear the disproportionate burden of passing on those cultural traditions. And then Asian men and women have had to deal with like long-standing stereotypes and tensions between multiple cultures and gender role expectations. And although, there are some similarities between Asian and white values, the emphasis has often been on the contrasting differences. So, like, for example, there's images of Asian women as being subservient and passive and childlike and innocent, maybe even exotic, like mail order brides, dragon ladies, or maybe even conscientious hard workers. And Asian men are often stereotyped as being like nerdy or geeky, feminine, industrious, passive, asexual. And the stereotypes attributed to the Asian women, like the mail order brides and the dragon ladies, they've kind of had this effect that's led to sexual exploitation and like a continued objectification of these women. And then, the dominant myth of Asian males as asexual and feminine is going to render Asian men a lot less desirable. And within the context of like a bicultural socialization, Asian men and women have kind of needed to negotiate competing cultural representations of like masculinity or femininity. And it's got a lot of important implications as they're managing their gender identity. And another aspect that's kind of complicated this picture is like the shifts in roles and responsibilities. Immigration really created role reversals for some Asian immigrants that significantly influenced their family roles and their expectations. And the shifts have resulted in a greater need for dual income families and greater struggles on the part of the women to achieve that equal access to resources. And, due to the difficulties in the occupational mobility for some foreign-born Asian men, more women have experienced a need to work outside of the family. So, although a person's sexual identity or their sexuality and being attracted to another person is like an integral part of human life and relationships, the meanings that are attached to sexuality and sexual behaviors are experienced and really informed differently based on like the cultural and the religious and the familial and also like acculturative influences. So historically, Asian cultures have really depicted their attitudes and openness to sexual issues through like the arts and literature and religion and history and philosophy, with like these sexual themes covering a range of orientations. So, for instance, the existence of homosexuality and bisexuality and other forms of sexuality have been noted in erotic art and paintings and wall carvings as just normal subjects in Japanese and Indian artistic ventures. But through the years, due to like political and social and religious influences, Asian cultural norms have become a little bit more restrictive, and they kind of place a strong emphasis on silence surrounding the issue of sexuality. So this negative attitude is not only seen within the context of like heterosexual intimacy, the issues in the heterosexual intimacy, but it really takes on like a great significance within the context of homosexuality. Specifically, like Asian Americans perceive like homosexuality as like this Western concept. Um, it's kind of like based in the notion that one becomes homosexuality from contact with like the foreigners. So homosexuality has kind of been seen as like a white disease, and therefore is like really not a natural part of the Asian society. But although acculturation and exposure to the U.S. values may play an important role in more positive attitudes towards sexuality and like those sexual identity issues, the familial and the cultural influences are going to predominate here. And that's an expectation in those traditional Asian American families that the children are going to marry and they're going to have children. So as Asian American sexual minorities are developing their identity, they're going to experience pressures that are related to marriage, and a fear of that familial rejection may be a major hindrance in the ownership of that identity and the coming out process. And then like culturally, the religion is going to play a significant role. So like for instance here, like the majority of the religions like Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Taoism, they seem to have a negative and stringent attitude toward sex and homosexuality. Although like some of the religious teachings like Confucianism or Hinduism, they kind of subscribe to like a balance between female and male. So we have like Yin in Confucianism, Shakti in Hinduism, and then we have like Yang in Confucianism and Shiva in Hinduism, so like male, female, and we have those attributes. And the focus is primarily on like heterosexual relations, but any leanings towards homosexuality are seen as kind of like a sin, and so they're unacceptable. In 1998, Chung and his colleagues did a research, and they said it was really important to recognize that Asian Americans need to undergo like a dual but parallel developmental process in relation to their ethnic and sexual identities, because these two processes of identity development may happen simultaneously, or one may follow the other, and it may be complicated by their racial socialization as well. So how Asian Americans are negotiating these minority identities, what the relative salience of each identity might be for that person, and how those identities are intersecting and interacting at different points in their life are really going to become important. So across these Asian American populations, mental health stigma remains one of the most significant barriers to care. Seeking therapy can be seen as like bringing shame to the family or admitting a moral failure. And Asian Americans are among the least likely of any racial group to seek mental health services. Despite their high levels of stress, their high levels of anxiety and depression, and in the subgroups like the refugees or the high achieving youth, despite all of that, they're still the least likely of any of the racial groups to seek mental health services. And then we have like language barriers and a lack of culturally competent providers that add to the problem. And clients are going to present distress through like somatization, or experiencing like the psychological pain as like physical symptoms, like I have a headache or fatigue or stomach pain. And so counselors have to use those culturally adapted assessments and interventions that really normalize the help seeking, like they're going to link mental health to the overall wellness and collaborate with the community leaders or the religious figures when it's appropriate. So let's jump in here and look at this in a little bit more detail. Questions about the prevalence of the psychological disorders among Asian Americans are like questions of both clinical and empirical concern. So, for instance, here, like answers to questions like how prevalent is depression among Chinese, or how common is it for Filipinos to encounter racism? These are critical to providing researchers and clinicians with like this baseline understanding of the psychological status of Asian American communities. But despite the value of these questions, the counselor should be cautious in reviewing the literature for answers. Because as a relatively new field, the research on counseling Asian Americans is far from definitive and more likely just to provide conflicting answers as like a function of like different samples and surveys and analytical strategies. So to give us some insights rather than answers to these questions, the researchers have generally just used two approaches. The first one is epidemiological studies that really attempt to like be representative of a particular population at large. And then the other one is like small scale studies that use smaller convenience samples. And while these epidemiological studies are clearly valuable, drawing conclusions from like national studies like that have really hampered, they've been hampered by like the relatively small samples of Asian Americans and the aggregation of the Asian Americans across the ethnic groups. A few of these studies, like the Chinese American Psychiatric Epidemiological Study, which was called CAPES, and the Filipino American Community Epidemiological Study, which was called FACES, they provided some invaluable insights. And, you know, the recently completed National Latino and Asian American Study, this was the first nationally representative study, and that really promised a rich source of information. And consequently, in this part of this lesson, I'm reviewing the existence of literature on racism and its relationship to the psychological distress, more specifically, the prevalence of depression and PTSD and domestic violence and anxiety and schizophrenia. So we'll jump into those next. I want to look at racism first, though, because the research on the prevalence rate for racisms is emerging, and it's very far from definitive. And part of the challenge in these studies is the manner in which we in which a construct like racism is defined and how it's measured. So in 1995, there was a research study that found that 15 to 39% of Asian Americans reported having experienced a major incident of racial discrimination. But in 2006, there was another study that reported that 98% of Asian Americans experienced at least one instance of racial microaggression, like a racial insult or being treated rudely. So counselors can benefit from attending to the methodological processes of how these people were evaluating these studies. But there has been like consistent empirical evidence to indicate that racism is related to like lower levels of psychological well-being. And so racism is found to have an adverse impact on self-esteem and depression and race-related stress. So there was another study that found that racism within the military put Asian American Vietnam veterans at a higher risk for PTSD, more so than the exposure to actual combat. And that kind of challenges the belief that like seemingly positive stereotypes are not harmful. Another study in 2000 found that when ethnic identity was salient for Asian Americans, their academic performance diminished under what was called the choke under pressure phenomenon. And presumably this was, because the pressure to conform to that model minority expectation of like high academic standards. So racism appears to be an experience with considerable and adverse psychological consequences. And studies on depression among Asian Americans have generally suggested that Asian Americans experience major depressive disorders at a rate that's equal to or lower than that of the general population. But there are studies that indicate that depression rates may be higher than that of the general population. Like in the CAPE study, they had 1,747 Chinese American adults in the Los Angeles area, and they found that 3.4% had depression over the last 12 months, which was lower than the 6.6 rate in the general population for a replication of the National Comorbidity Study. But using self-report measures, depression rates among Asian American adults have ranged from 12% to 41%. And among studies with the youth, back in 2007, they found that in 7 out of 9 major studies, there were no significant differences in depression rates between Asian Americans and the other racial groups, and that the rates range from 2.6% to 12.8% using diagnostic interviews. And of those demographic groups that have been examined, the elderly Asian Americans appear to be at greatest risk for depression, with the rates as high as 40%. But in review of like those 7 studies with those elderly Asian Americans back in 2007, they found 3 studies with rates lower than that of white Americans, and 3 studies with comparable rates, and 1 study with higher rates. So with such a wide range of conclusions, it may be a little bit more helpful for counselors to evaluate these studies and with some degree of caution here. The pre-migration traumas, particularly among the Southeast Asian refugees, have really been consistently associated with the incidence of PTSD and suicide and depression. And in the most comprehensive study to date on Cambodian refugees, Marshall, Shell, Elliott, Berthold, and Chun in 2005 found that 62% suffered from PTSD and 51% had major depression in the last year. So kind of like to contextualize these rates, they also described that like 99% of the participants reported near-death starvation, and 90% had family or friends who were murdered, and 54% of them were tortured prior to coming to the United States. And the effects of that trauma can be multi-generational. So there was another study on like Cambodian American refugees in 1994, found that 58% of mothers and 29% of fathers and 18% of children demonstrated symptoms of PTSD. And the rates of depression were also elevated, and they range from 11% for children and 14% for fathers and 18% for mothers. And so, as those studies are illustrating, it seems that, women exhibit higher levels of psychological distress. And even more disturbingly, there's been evidence to kind of indicate that the effects of migration trauma can persist over time. There was in that 1999 study, they found that, after a 12-year follow-up, 35% of those Cambodian refugees continued to exhibit PTSD symptoms, and 14% of them exhibited symptoms of depression. So the experiences of the Southeast Asian American refugees are significantly different from their immigration peers. And there have been efforts at determining the prevalence of domestic violence among Asian Americans, but it's kind of been hampered by limited research, particularly in terms of like representative epidemiological studies. In the National Survey of Violence Against Women in 2000, they found that Asian Pacific Islanders were the targets of rape and physical assault by their partners at lifetime rates of like 3.8% and 12.8% respectively. So those rates were lower than what white women reported, because they said 7.7% for rape and 21% for physical assault. And they also reported that 49.6% of Asian American women reported being physically assaulted, and 6.8% were raped by some individual, not necessarily their partner. And additionally, the authors of that study cautioned that the rates may be underreported due to like the cultural values around self-disclosure. There's silence around domestic violence that may be perpetuated by like the cultural values and the need to maintain group harmony and save face, but also because of the tactics like social isolation and the threats to the woman's reputation and their immigration status by the abuser. And so, given the limited research in this area, the studies using non-representative convenience samples may be the best alternative that we have right now. And there was a relatively large study of 336 Asian Americans by the National Asian Women's Health Organization. They said 8% of the women reported that they'd been raped, and 19% said that they were pressured to have sex, and 26% reported that they were the target of physical or emotional abuse by their partners. And back in 2007, another study reported that community-based studies of domestic violence among the Asian American women found rates ranging from 24% to 60%. But, while the existing evidence in this area is far from definitive, the most salient finding for counselors to consider is just the overwhelming majority of Asian American women, which was about 95 to 97%, have never used preventative or treatment services despite of a high incidence of violence in their lives. And there's fewer studies that have been conducted on like the prevalence of anxiety disorders and schizophrenia. So the available research has been relatively consistent in suggesting that these disorders occur at rates lower than, or maybe even similar to, white people. For instance, there was an analysis of epidemiological catchment, and they had over 18,000 participants across the country that found that Asian Americans reported the lowest lifetime rates of schizophrenia, phobias, and obsessive compulsive disorders among all the racial groups. And then in 1995, Sue and her colleagues found that the Chinese Americans reported lower rates of generalized anxiety disorders, agoraphobia, simple phobias, and panic disorders. But this researcher cautioned that, the definitive conclusions about the status of the psychopathology among Asian Americans may be premature because there's a limited range of studies in this area, and there's been like a failure of existing studies in tapping the heterogeneity of the Asian American communities. So to bridge this methodological issue, Takuchi in 2007 conducted a national Latino and Asian American study, And it was the most comprehensive study of Latino and Asian Americans for mental health so far. And so it was a sample of 2,095 Asian Americans, and that was 600 Chinese, 508 Filipinos, 520 Vietnamese, 141 Asian Indian, 107 Japanese, 81 Koreans, and 138 individuals that were categorized as other. And while a lot of that data, it showed a 17.3% rate for any psychiatric disorder. So from that study, there was an overall prevalence of 17.3%. U.S. born Asian Americans had the highest lifetime rates for any disorder and for substance use disorders. And immigrants had lower overall prevalence rates compared to the U.S. born population. And gender played a role in the specific disorders, like the U.S. born men had the highest risk for substance use disorders, while U.S. born women had the highest risk for mood disorders. And for substance use disorders, U.S. men or U.S. born men or people, both men and women, they had the highest rates followed by the later generations of the immigrants. And the youngest immigrant women showed a significantly higher rate of any mood disorder compared to the other immigrant women. And this study also highlighted that despite having mental health needs, Asian Americans were less likely to seek mental health services compared to the other populations. So help seeking is just this really complicated process, obviously. Although there is a need for mental health services, only a portion of those people who need professional help are going to seek out these services. And although several variables are going to influence the help seeking, researchers have emphasized that, coping strategies and their perceived effectiveness have to be understood and evaluated against the backdrop of that cultural group's values and their norms and their worldviews. So for us to really understand Asian American help seeking, we need to understand how help seeking may be influenced by like the values and the worldviews. And so the remainder of this lesson is really going to highlight those specific issues that are related to those mental health issues among Asian Americans. So the literature has consistently revealed that Asian Americans underutilize mental health services. Data from the National Institute on Mental Health on utilization rates for a broad range of mental health services has revealed that Asian American Pacific Islanders were 3 times less likely than their white counterparts to use mental health services. And interestingly, there were some similar results that were found for 16 of the states with the highest AAPI populations. And that NLAAS study reported that only 8.6% of Asian Americans with a psychological problem sought any form of professional help. And of those who received help, only 3% of them were of the Asian American people sought help from mental health providers. And U.S. born Asian Americans were more likely to see a mental health provider than a foreign born Asian American. So in 1990, they found that Asian Americans in general are less likely to seek professional mental health services as their primary source of help. But on the flip side of that, when Asian Americans do seek help, they're noted to prematurely terminate psychotherapy treatment. So comparisons of the help-seeking attitudes between the Asian and the international students and the European American students have really yielded similar results. But the studies have shown that Asian international students have less favorable attitudes towards psychotherapy. And there's been similar trends that have been found in large-scale studies, like analyzing the public mental health system usage. And there have been some instances when researchers have found like a small percentage of Asian Americans to overutilize mental health services. And those trends have kind of increased since the 1970s. So there was a 1991 study that examined data maintained by the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health for their clients entering the system between 1983 and 1988. And although Asian Americans constitute only 3% of outpatients and 8% of the county population, these patients seem to exhibit more severe disorders when compared to their white counterparts, and they engaged in a greater number of treatment sessions and received medication-based treatments more frequently. And a lot of similar trends were found in 2003. They did an analysis of public mental health services in San Diego County between 1991 and 1994. So in addition to like the severity of the symptoms and the longer lengths of stays, the Asian Americans were more likely to use outpatient and day treatment programs when compared to like the other ethnic groups. And there have been a lot of Southeast Asian and the East Asian groups that have overutilized mental health services. And the research also revealed other instances when Asian Americans seem to utilize the services at higher rates. So in 1986, there was a study that noted that Asian American college students tend to seek counseling when faced with academic and vocational problems. And that might be because like the emphasis on career issues is consistent with like the Asian cultural values related to like education. And a lot of similar studies have found that when Asian American communities offer ethnic specific services, both Asian American children and adults are less likely to drop out of treatment prematurely and stay in treatment for longer periods and have better treatment outcomes. And although Asian Americans experience difficulties with a range of issues like academic, interpersonal, family, intergenerational issues, there's substance abuse, health, identity, racism, all of those things, they might display less favorable attitudes towards seeking help with professional mental health providers. While the interaction between the client and the counselor can really influence the help seeking, there are several individual and sociocultural and structural institutional barriers that have really been noted as influencing those help seeking attitudes and behaviors. So at the individual level, there's like a lack of knowledge or exposure to the Western mental health treatment and misconceptions about those professional counseling agencies that may be barriers to seeking that professional help. And this might be closely related to like the immigration history. You know, a significant positive relationship has been noted between like highly acculturated college students and like attitudes towards seeking that professional help. Additionally, like limited language proficiency and the client counselor ethnic matching or other individual level factors that have really deemed or kind of seem to like influence that help seeking among the Asian Americans. The counselor client ethnic matching not only increases the utilization of services, but it also decreases the premature termination among Asian Americans. And this is particularly true for clients who don't have English as their primary language. But on the flip side of that, like the ethnic matching in the client counselor dyad is not found to predict increases in services for Southeast Asians. And, perhaps like with other groups, it's possible that the racial and the cultural identity might play a more important role here. And then at the sociocultural level, we have like cultural values and views of mental health, expressions of distress, stigmatization of persons with mental illness and the mental health service use, and the availability of any other alternative healing practices have really been noted to kind of contribute to the underutilization of the mental health services. And this may be especially true of like Asian Americans who reside in immigrant communities. So like, for instance, like the notion of shame or loss of face has been identified as like a significant barrier in the mental health service utilization. So there's terms like, I can't pronounce any of these words, but these terms, they typically are used to highlight the shame that may be incurred in the communities. And so utilization of the mental health services may be seen as like a public admission that something is wrong. And so it's likely going to compromise the family and their social status. Personal problems and weaknesses are not only shared by those family members, but the family is also seen as responsible for taking care of that problem. So seeking professional counseling may be seen as kind of like breaking away from the family resilience and going against the privacy of the family. And there's like cultural factors that also influence how Asian Americans perceive the symptoms or causes of the disorder, and in turn, the specific intervention that might be effective. Um, Within the Asian cultures, the mind and the body are considered inseparable. So health and well-being are seen holistically, and it's going to include the mental, physical, and the spiritual components. And due to that interconnectedness between the mind and the body, psychopathology is often conceptualized within physical and spiritual frameworks. So it's not uncommon to see Asian Americans present with physical symptoms like headaches or dizziness when they're emotionally stressed. And due to the spiritual focus, the symptoms may be seen as like embedded within a religious context. There's been some studies that have kind of revealed that the immigrant communities believe that problems are preordained or a result of past lives or maybe karma caused by like supernatural forces or like an imbalance between the yin and the yang. And that's consistent with the beliefs that the communities have been, they're known to seek out indigenous forms of healing. And they might want to seek out a site of resiliency. And this is going to represent those psychological or those physical spaces that help Asian Americans cope. And so in keeping with this, there's several sites of resiliency that have been kind of identified for the Asian American community. Like, for example, the use of alternative forms of healing is an important source of resiliency. And so this is really true for like the Asian immigrants whose cultural values and their beliefs greatly influence their daily lives and their practices towards health and well-being. So these alternative forms of healing are not only consistent with the Asian cultural values, but they seem kind of integral in maintaining a sense of self within the communities. So like alternative healers tend to treat the illnesses with like a cultural or familial or communal context. And because of that holistic emphasis on the health and a spiritually guided life, themes of like fatalism and karma and religion are going to play a significant role in coping with those daily stressors. So Asian Americans have really been known to seek out religious or faith healers and religious organizations like churches or temples and engage in chanting and prayer and like religious ceremonies and lighting of lamps and other things like that. And other related sources have kind of included like palm reading and religious ceremonies, astrology, whatever. And so like due to like the belief in creating that mind body harmony, Asians may engage in activities like tai chi and yoga, acupuncture and therapeutic massage. And due to the belief in like the bodily imbalance across these cultures, nutrition is another popular means of restoring health. And that's exemplified in the use of like herbal medicines and specific foods. So some common counseling themes among Asian American clients are gonna include acculturation stress. That's like the struggle to balance the heritage culture with like the American norms. And this is often going to play out in like the parent-child relationships. Parents might emphasize obedience and modesty while the children are valuing independence and self-expression. And then the gender and the family roles are another source of the tension. The traditional hierarchies are often assigned caregiving duties to the women and leadership to the men. And through these expectations, there's going to be some changing among those younger generations. And then we have the model minority myth, and that's going to portray the Asians as uniformly successful and hardworking, and it's going to create this unrealistic pressure and mask any disparities. And it also silences those that are struggling with mental illness and domestic violence or poverty by just implying that they don't need support. And then, we have like the racialized stress, especially following COVID-19, has increased the anxiety and the hypervigilance and the community fear. And counselors should assess for racism and related trauma and provide some safe spaces to process identity. And when we work with Asian American clients, establishing trust is going to take time, and it's going to begin with rapport building. We want to express genuine respect and remember key family members' names and use culturally appropriate greetings or titles. We want to balance the respect with collaboration because a lot of clients expect an expert, a directive counselor, rather than just a purely non directive listener. So you can blend that person-centered warmth with the structural guidance. We also want to incorporate family and cultural values into the treatment. Like, for example, highlight how the emotional well-being is going to support the family harmony or fulfill that filial duty. And that's going to reframe therapy as a strength, not as a shame. And then lastly, we want to adapt to indirect communication. Clients might hesitate to say no or disagree openly. So use reflection and observation. Notice what's unsaid and make space for gentle exploration rather than confrontation. So multicultural competence begins before counselors enter the session, and it's going to start with a frank assessment of ourselves. Specific to Asian Americans, we as counselors are encouraged to obtain training and attend workshops and presentations and familiarize ourselves with the literature on this community before we start our work with these particular types of clients. So, in effect, we need to assess the extent to which we are familiar with what's been presented here in this lesson. And then on a personal level, we would do well to reflect upon our socialization experiences with Asian Americans. What are our assumptions and biases about this community and the extent to which this may all influence our work as a counselor? Some people have argued that, the need for this self-reflection is mandatory regardless of whether the client and the counselor are similar or different in terms of race or ethnicity or gender or even in cultural dimension. But in effect, despite those phenotypic similarities between like the counselor and the client, the psychological meaning that each attributes to these identities may be entirely different and far more critical. And then, given like the significances of race or gender or the experiences of oppression, us as counselors, we may further benefit from like this awareness of the extent to which we are comfortable and able to raise these issues to up in counseling. These are relatively taboo topics, so it's going to be important for us to recognize that clients are unlikely to raise up these issues on their own, despite their potential significance in that counseling relationship. So, for instance, like I could, how often are we thinking that a client's just going to simply just come right out and say, I want to talk to you about the fact that you're a white counselor and I'm an Asian American? It's not really going to come up unless you bring it up. So as a result, both the responsibility and the power to do this lies with you. And the counseling process refers to what happens in therapy between the counselor and the client. And specifically, it's referring to like the within session interactions and the factors that are influencing the dynamics in counseling. So, in essence, this includes like overt and covert contributions from the counselor. So, like your professional training, the personality of the counselor, what your interpersonal style is, your verbal and your nonverbal interventions that you use, countertransference, what your intentions are. And then like with the client, their personality, their worldviews, their previous experience in and outside of therapy, their readiness for change, and their transference. And then we have like the interactional dynamics between the counselor and the client, like the working alliance and the rapport. So being attuned to these different aspects is going to be key to effective counseling. The primary focus in counseling is on verbal communication, and this expectation that clients talk about their issues goes against some of those Asian cultural values, like the stigma attached to sharing that personal information with a stranger. So developing a relationship first with your Asian American client is important in creating a trusting environment that's going to allow conversations to happen. And in particular, the use of like the specific types of counselor self-disclosures, like strategies, intimate disclosures, things like that, has been really found to be helpful in the client-counselor relationship. So, like, for instance, maybe disclosing tangible ideas that are used in personal challenges that might, share some similarity with those that the client has noted to increase those trust levels in that client counselor relationship. So, we want to initiate discussion on potential counselor client differences. That helps with building the relationship with your client. Discussing those differences related to aspects like race and ethnicity and gender is going to allow for contextualization of that experience, and then addressing any potential miscommunications that might evolve in that emotional and personal relationship. So I want you to consider how you would work with a client using those things. And for some Asian Americans, the use of mental health or counseling services is really related to like knowing somebody who works or is connected to someone in a setting. So in essence, like word of mouth referrals play a significant role in Asian Americans seeking counseling. So this is really strongly related to like the issue of like credibility here. And counselor credibility is an incredibly important factor in mental health utilization among Asian Americans. It's like the notion of the counselor is an expert and they should be trustworthy. And so the perceived expertness in a counselor is typically a function of their reputation, evidence of like their specialized training, behavioral evidence of proficiency and competency. So like, for example, like a rehabilitations counselor credibility might be reflected in their familiarity with like the state and federal regulations on disability issues and how that's affecting the client's rights. And such a testimony of expertness becomes all the more important when coming from someone within the community. So that perceived trustworthiness, on the other hand, is going to like encompass factors like sincerity and openness and honesty and a perceived lack of motivation for personal gain. So really intrinsic to developing trust is the extent to which the counselor self-discloses personal information. Knowing a counselor at a personal level is going to allow the Asian American clients to develop a sense of safety and kinship that might be needed to build that therapeutic relationship. But in like a related fashion, the fact that actions speak louder than words is a notion that's been really well established in the South Asian community. So when caseworkers and other professionals go beyond the client to address client systems, like engaging in advocacy and facilitating connections between services, the South Asian participants seem to give that person a little bit more credibility. So I want you to do an activity here. This activity is going to help you to visualize how intersecting cultural factors shape a client's worldview. So for instance, an Indian American client may value family and honor and educational achievement and also spiritual devotion, while a Vietnamese refugee might prioritize survival and humility and gratitude. So mapping these factors is going to clarify counseling goals and help you choose culturally sensitive interventions. So create a cultural identity map of a fictional or even a real Asian client. And I want you to include the country of origin and their language spoken. What is their religion or their philosophy? What family structure or gender roles do they have? What's their acculturation level? And what values and traditions and stressors do they have? Let me jump into religion really quick. Religion and spirituality are vital across Asian cultures. Buddhism, Hinduism, and Confucianism, among others, are going to provide meaning systems that shape ideas of like suffering and karma and mindfulness. So counselors should view these not as barriers, but as a therapeutic entry point. Practices like meditation, chanting, and prayer are only going to complement our clinical methods. So respect is key here. Don't just assume that every client practices their tradition, and avoid using like spirituality to bypass the psychological pain. Instead, we want to co-create a holistic model that honors both the culture and care. So let's look at this case study. This case underscores the importance of worldview. The counselor assumed autonomy and independence were universally healthy goals, but for the students, prioritizing family duty over personal preference is a moral choice. A culturally attuned counselor might explore balance, but how can she honor her parents' expectations and care for her emotional well-being? Respecting the family piety, it doesn't mean reinforcing oppression. It just means meeting the clients where they are and helping them navigate the value conflict safely. So in this case, a Japanese exchange student is struggling with sadness and anxiety and pressure from the family expectations. And so the counselor is encouraging autonomy and living her own life, but the student withdraws. So how does the counselor's worldview clash with the client's? And how could those collectivistic values have been better respected by the clinician? And jumping into social advocacy and social justice for just a second, social advocacy is the act of arguing on behalf of an individual, group, or idea or issue in the pursuit of influencing outcomes. And social justice refers to a belief in a just world, like a world with fair treatment and equal distribution of benefits of society, that's respecting and protecting the human rights. So in essence, it's referring to the ethics surrounding equitable access to resources and services. So in examining the ethics codes and the guidelines for several mental health organizations, there's a few reoccurring themes surrounding ethical behavior of counselors. So the first reoccurring theme is like respect for the integrity and strength of the client or the community. Respecting communities is going to involve acquiring adequate knowledge about the community and being respectful of those differences. And respect is like that foundation for engaging in social justice work, because it's really ensuring that counselors understand and abide by that community's strengths and goals and determinations. So as we're working with the Asian American communities, we have to be mindful of like the constant shifts and changes in the cultural boundaries within the different contexts. And it is possible to be informed about the Asian American community, but it is not possible to know everything. So it's important for us to engage in a constant process of like raising our awareness of Asian Americans in different contexts. A second theme in the ethical guidelines is that of responsibility. Responsibility is just this assertion that counselors are going to help clients have access to resources and minimize bias and discrimination and be a part of the solution. And then the third theme is ethics, in ethics, is that of action. And this is explicit, and it's an intentional call to take steps to contribute our professional time to service without compensation or personal advantage. So action can occur through like education, advocacy, lobbying for like the betterment of the community. So rather than like relegate the highlighting Asian American history and like experiences during Asian American History Month alone, we need to explore how issues that are salient to Asian Americans are being addressed and how they're integrated in like day-to-day curriculum and instruction and activity. The social justice is going to be about becoming actively involved with like the other outside the counseling setting, like community events, social and political functions, celebrations, friendships, maybe neighborhood groups, whatever, just so we can develop a perspective that's beyond the academics. And cultural humility means reassessing how we diagnose and treat distress. In some Asian cultures, restraint and modesty are virtues. They're not symptoms of avoidance or depression. So we need to be careful not to over-pathologize those behaviors that are aligning with the cultural norms. We want to use narrative therapy to let clients tell their migration, their immigration and identity stories, and explore how they've studied or survived and adapted. And we want to encourage bicultural integration. That's going to help clients find harmony between the heritage and the mainstream cultures rather than just choosing one over the other. And then lastly, advocacy matters here. A lot of Asian Americans face systemic barriers like language access, anti-Asian racism, and stereotyping. So culturally competent counseling must extend beyond the therapy room to community and policy advocacy. So as we're wrapping up, remember that Asian American is a broad umbrella that's covering extraordinary diversity. Our responsibility is to treat each client as an individual while also acknowledging the cultural and the historical and the systemic contexts that are shaping their lives. We want to recognize stigma. We want to normalize help seeking and address the acculturation stress with empathy. And remember, cultural competence is not the endpoint. It's a lifelong practice that's rooted in humility and curiosity and advocacy.